Okay, so we're getting into trig graphs, and the first things we're going to talk about are changes in amplitude and midline stuff today. So all vertical stuff. So the first thing I'll start with is your parent graph for sine of x, and everything I think on your homework is going to look for from negative 2 pi to 2 pi. So I'm going to give my x-axis there and my y-axis there. And every curve really has 4 sections, one for each quadrant. So when you go from 0 to 1 pi to 2 pi, I'm going to have kind of each square be one quadrant. So there's pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. So a sine curve, sine of 0 is 0, and the sine of pi over 2 is already 1. And then, remember how I kind of give you my unit circle of sines? That's 0, and then it goes up to 1. Then it comes back down to 0 by the time you get to pi, and then it goes down to negative 1 at 3 pi over 2, and then it comes back to 0. And then this whole graph is just going to keep repeating itself. So when we go backwards, if that's negative pi and that's negative 2 pi, we're going backwards, that's kind of going this way. Negative pi over 2 is negative 1, and then when you get to negative pi, you're back to 0. When you get to negative 3 pi over 2, you're at negative 1, and negative 2 pi is 0. So I like to think of the sine parent graph as the one that starts on the midline and ends on the midline, and has a halfway point on the midline. Cosine, on the other hand, doesn't start on the midline. It actually starts at a maximum, unless it's been reflected. So the cosine, remember if we go around, the cosine of 0 is 1. So if this is 0, and this is pi, and this is 2 pi, the cosine of 0 is actually 1. And then by the time you get to pi over 2, it's down to 0. And then by the time you get to pi, it's negative 1. And then it's back to 0. And then at 2 pi, it's back to 1. So a cosine curve actually starts on a maximum, ends after its full rotation at 2 pi on a maximum, and then halfway in between it hits its minimum, and halfway in between the max and mins, it's always going to hit the midline. So if I'm tracing that backwards, we have that's negative 2 pi. So the A, the coefficient out in front, the absolute value of that is your amplitude. Your C is your vertical shift. So anytime something gets shifted up or down, it's really where your midline will be. So C is the vertical shift, also ends up being your midline. The frequency and period we'll come up with over the next couple days, but the period for these, because we haven't stretched or compressed them at all, the period, the length of one cycle that is still 2 pi. So with something like this, y equals 2 sine x, we're just going to do the sine parent graph. So there's pi, and there's 2 pi. The sine parent graph starts on a 0, ends at a 0, hits the midline, or hits the halfway point on the midline, is 0 as well. So the sine parent graph typically just looks like this, unless it's been reflected, but this one has not. This one just has been vertically stretched by 2. So whereas the amplitude used to be 1, now the amplitude is going to be 2. And so it's going to hit a maximum of 2, and a minimum of negative 2, and then that's just going to continue. So if you continue this way, negative pi and negative 2 pi, down to negative 2. But I always like to start with like just the first cycle from 0 to 2 pi and see what happens. 3 cosine, and we can always change, we can always trace it backwards into the negatives. So there's 0, pi, and 2 pi, if I'm scaling. Now cosine start at maximums, and this one's at 3. So it starts at a maximum, and at 2 pi it's going to end at a maximum. The halfway point at pi is going to be at a minimum of negative 3. And then your zeros, your midline intersections, that is, are halfway in between 0 and pi at pi over 2. So you've got your bottom side of the cosine graph and your top side. And again, you could kind of continue this backwards as needed. So that's just an amplitude change. On the next two, we have a reflection. So this is a positive sign. This is a positive cosine. So a negative cosine is going to go minimum to minimum with that general pattern, and a negative sine is going to go down and then up. But again, sines start and end on the midline. Cosines start and end on a maximum or start and end on a minimum, depending on if they're positive or negative. So a negative cosine starts at a minimum, and this particular one is like flipped because it's negative and it's a minimum of 2. So here's pi and here's 2 pi. So it's going to also end at negative 2. And then it's going to have a max halfway in between at positive 2, and then zeros kind of fill in the gap. So there's your cosine graph stretched vertically by 2 and flipped upside down. And then that would continue that way, and that would continue that way. Negative sine just got flipped upside down. So starts on the midline, ends on the midline, halfway point on the midline because it's a sine. And negative means it just goes down first. Amplitude's still 1 technically, so it goes down first and then up. And so there's your first cycle of that. And then this will continue if you want to go that way, and vice versa if you want to come back. It depends on what window you're being told. So I'm just doing 0 to 2 pi. You may have to do negative 2 pi to 2 pi, so just kind of continue your pattern to the left. And then the last two change your midline. So if knowing that my midline got shifted up 2, this is like what I'm going to treat as my new x-axis. So it's a sine graph. It starts on the midline. There's pi and there's 2 pi. And it ends on the midline. And it has a halfway point on the midline. And then it reaches its positive sign, so it's going to go up first to reach its maximum, which is an amplitude of 1, which means it's just going 1 unit above the midline. The maximum value is 1, 2, 3, but that's only an amplitude of 1 above the midline, and then 1 below the midline. And there's your cycle from 0 to 2 pi, and again, you could continue that in either direction. Number 6 has a midline change and an amplitude change. So off of our midline, which has been shifted down 3, so I'm going to give myself space below 1, 2, 3. There's our new midline, okay? Our cosine curve, here's pi, here's 2 pi. Our cosine curve is a positive cosine, so it starts high, ends high. So starting high in this case means it's an amplitude of 2 above the midline, which is there, starting at maximum. It ends at that same maximum level. Halfway in between there is a minimum, which is 2 units, the amplitude below the midline, and then we actually hit the midline halfway in between 0 and pi and halfway in between pi and 2. So we see a vertical stretch of our cosine graph and a shift down 3, continue as needed. So if you obviously want to go re-watch that and slow it down and pause it at moments just to process things, I know I went through that fast, but you have the rest of the period to work on your homework.